Hello, and we are thankful that you are joining us for New Life today. I am your host, Pastor Gregg Tipton, and we are going to go back to the Church of Thyatira for just a little bit. We started it in a previous video, which you can find the link in the description, and we encourage you to go back and watch this first video. So we're going to jump into that right now. Revelation chapter 2, starting in verse 18 and kind of working its way down through there, Jesus sends a letter to a church, Thyatira. Now, he has sent a total of 7. I know it is out of sync of the churches that they are sent. I really am not and was not planning on doing a series on the 7 churches. I wanted to talk about this particular church because there is something to it that I believe as believers, as Christians, in the day and the hour that we're living in, we need to pay attention to, because I believe that the traits of this church, along with the others, I believe you find traits and characteristics of all 7 churches in this age, in this time, within the church, but I believe that we're going to begin to see an explosion of the attitudes and characteristics of this church in the very near future. And so Jesus sends a letter to this church. Now, something that is interesting is, of course, you can look in the previous video. I shared how Jesus presented himself or manifested himself to the church. He had eyes of fire, feet of brass. He is walking and looking, and he was testing and walking in judgment and looking and piercing. But Jesus then begins to give them a commendation as well as a condemnation. Now, one of the unique things that Jesus does, which anybody will tell you if you're ever going to bring reproof or correction, you always want to remind the person that's being corrected of all of the good things about them, the things that you find that they do well, the things that you find that they are strong in, before you come in with the corrective action. And so Jesus does that. Look at what Jesus says. He says, I know your works. Now, this goes back to his piercing and looking at them. I know your works. Nothing is hid from me. And he says to Thyatira, he says, I know your works of service, your work of faith, your work of patience or perseverance, you could put there. And as for your works, the last are more than the first. So Thyatira was to be commended, because as the other churches were losing their first love, or the previous church was, one of the previous churches, and another was losing their zeal, they were falling asleep. The churches that he followed, the church of Ephesus and the church of Smyrna. Ephesus, they lost their first love. Smyrna, he said, you need to wake up. He says, you've got a name that you're alive, but you're dead. And he said, you need to wake up. And so they were losing their first love. They were losing their zeal, but not the church of Thyatira. The church of Thyatira, in fact, was growing and increasing in their service, in their love, their faith, their patience, or their perseverance. In fact, to the point that Jesus says to them, the last is even more than the first. So the latter works are even more than your first works. So you're not just not losing your love, and you're not just not losing your zeal, but you are actually increasing in them. But then Jesus comes in with the rub, and he says, and I have this against you. So I've commended you because of what you have been doing, but this is what I have against you. In this particular verse, it's chocked full of information as to why Jesus appears to the church the way that he does. Listen, anytime the Lord has to correct us, whether it be through the Word of God, whether it be through one of his agents, i.e. a pastor or minister of the gospel, whether it be through our parents, whether it be through those whom we are employed by, whatever the case may be, whenever correction comes, it is for our betterment, it is for our strengthening, it is for our maturity. And so here Jesus gives us some verses that is chocked full of information. He says, nevertheless, verse 20, I have a few things against you. And here's what he says. He says, you allow, or you can read that word tolerate, you allow or tolerate that woman Jezebel to teach and to seduce my servants to commit sexual immorality and eat things sacrificed to idols. Now, some of the early manuscripts, when it talks about you permit that woman Jezebel, some of the early manuscripts say you permit your wife. You permit your wife Jezebel to teach and to seduce. There's a whole host of things with Bible scholars as to what that means. Some said, well, it's the pastor's wife, the bishop of the church's wife, that he would not get her under control when it came to false doctrine. Some have said, well, it is used in the feminine voice in the Greek in order it's talking about false prophets. And so in the feminine tone, it is talking about these false prophets that have married themselves to that ministry. And they have become, in essence, as a wife to that church. Here's the thing. This symbolic Jezebel was to the church of Thyatira what Jezebel herself, the wife of Ahab, was to him. So Jesus is not speaking to the literal Jezebel. He's speaking to a symbolic Jezebel, but one who has picked up the same spirit and mantra and mantle. A self-styled prophetess, as closely attached to the church of Thyatira as a wife is to the husband, and as powerfully influencing for evil that church of Thyatira as Jezebel did Ahab, is referenced here. So Jesus says, listen, you have someone married to the church that is a Jezebel. And just as Jezebel caused Ahab to sin, also this Jezebel is driving, and notice the term he uses, not the church. He says, my servants. That's a scary thought. She is causing my servants to be seduced into immorality and to eat things offered to idols. Let's talk just a moment about Jezebel, who she is. Jezebel was a woman who was swift to shed blood, innocent blood. If you remember, she killed the prophets. They were hiding in caves. Elijah became scared of her and ran because she said, I'll have your head. Just like you had the head of my false prophets, I'll have yours as well. And she was a very bloody person. She came by it honestly because she was the product of a very bloody father, Ethbaal. Jezebel's father was the king of Sidon, who originally was a priest of the false deity Astarte. He gave himself a promotion when, according to Josephus, he assassinated and slew his predecessor who was on the throne. So Jezebel was just a chip off the old block when it came to the bloodiness. And with her strong will, she wielded the weak Abraham and Israel like a master craftsman does the tools of their trade. She moved him and Israel to move from the violation of the second commandment that was given to the people of God, which was, you shall not make any carved image in the likeness of anything that is in heaven above, in the earth beneath, or the water under the earth, to violating the first commandment by replacing the ox cherub that they worshiped and worshiping the false deity Bel. So she removes an image that they're looking at and saying, well, this is God. We still worship God, but we use this to have a form or a picture. And God said, don't do that. Second commandment, don't do that. Don't make anything that is like unto the birds of the air, the beasts in the earth, and those things which are in the water that are under the earth. And he said in the first verse, you shall have no other gods before me. And she moves them to do this. So here, Jesus is addressing this same individual or this same spirit, that what they are doing is they are using the name of God in order to bring in corrupt worship, corrupt doctrine, which always leads, whenever there is idolatry, it always leads to adultery, fornication, immorality. It all goes hand in hand. When we fall in love with anything outside of God and His Christ, it will always lead us to a wrong thing. And so Jesus says, I have this against you. He said, you tolerate that woman, Jezebel, or that spirit, that woman, that falsehood that has married itself to your church, and you have taken her. And she calls herself a prophetess. So she is using the gospel in a godless way to teach and seduce my servants to commit sexual immorality and eat things that are sacrificed to idols. And so Jesus is then going to give us a list, which we're going to look at in another video, of some characteristics of this Jezebel, which I believe is important for us to pay attention for the time that we're living in. So you won't want to miss that video. We're going to come back and have another insightful look at the church of Thyatira. Until then, God bless you.